Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Price Formation Enhancements Phase 2 Working Group. Today, we'll be having the topic of incorporating emergency actions into pricing. For this working group, we plan to discuss the topic of scarcity pricing. As well, this working group will discuss market mechanisms to incorporate pricing impacts of emergency actions during scarcity pricing. Today's call, we are going to be having recorded for informational and community purposes only. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. During this meeting, we encourage dialogue and engage different perspectives. So we also invite folks to submit comments through the verbal and chat window. Also, please make sure to provide comments in a professional and respectful manner. As well, please refrain from repeating anything that was previously said so we can manage time effectively. For today's asking a question, you may utilize the raise hand icon located on the bottom toolbar above your chat window. You'll be able to be added to the queue. You'll be unmuted. After 1 second, you'll be able to unmute yourself and also announce your full name and affiliation before speaking. If you do forget, I'll remind you through chat, but also we want to make sure we are able to capture your company name within our meetings. For today, also, those who are joined to the audio-only line, *3 will allow you to be added to the queue as well. And today, we have Silas, our event producer, who will be assisting us for questions within the chat. And you may also send out to all panelists as well if you have any specific questions that our policy leads can also review. But we will also be taking time during the presenters to ask questions, so make sure you can listen to that moment to ask a question. As a reminder, we do have this policy initiative stakeholder process that we go through for all initiatives. During this working group phase, we're currently working on the phase 2 of this process, and also we are working towards the straw proposal. We had mentioned this in a previous meeting on the steps that we're taking on specific topics to reach the straw proposal. The team will cover that in terms of the timing and scheduling, so we'll have that a better idea of where we stand within the proposal development phase. And at this time, I do have James Readers, who are our lead policy developer, and Danny Johnson, who is also a policy manager through the ISO, and we can go ahead and get started. Go ahead, James. I can't hear you. Go ahead, James. I think you're double muted.
Thank you. Yeah, I was WebEx muted. So thanks, Brenda, and welcome everybody. So today, our objective will be to close out a series of 4 workshops now on scarcity pricing for phase 2. After today's meeting, we will be taking formal stakeholder comment on the bucket of information that you've heard over the previous few sessions on scarcity pricing. And today's topic is generally a catch-all bucket for things that happen during emergency conditions that may put pressure on price formation that we want to talk about. And this was something that comes out of the phase 1 working group, where a lot of stakeholders were interested in discussing price formation as it relates to emergency conditions, sort of independent of the context of sort of the core scarcity pricing changes that we've been talking about in the previous weeks. So let's go on to the next slide, please. So just to recap, we're talking about scarcity pricing in this working group. Scarcity pricing, we believe, is critical for good reliability because it helps motivate market participants into the right courses of action to maintain balance when supply is tight. We also have been discussing in this working group that earlier scarcity pricing signals would be valuable because they can create more efficient and earlier responses to potential reliability events and encourage market participants to take actions that will prevent shortages from happening before they do, and can also potentially reduce the cost of reflecting those shortages if the market is responsive to those prices. Next slide, please. So we'll reflect a little bit on what the working group in phase 2 has discussed so far as it relates to scarcity pricing. On December 16th, 2024, CAISO presented some potential improvements to ancillary service procurement and how those improvements relate to scarcity pricing through the CAISO's existing scarcity reserve demand curve. If you click on the blue link here, it will take you to that discussion. In those discussions, the presentation and materials and recordings should be available on the CAISO's website under the Stakeholder Initiatives page for price formation. Then on January 22nd, we held 2 workshops that day. And in the morning session, the ISO presented some potential mechanisms for implementing this concept of gradual price increase during scarcity conditions, and included within that conversation 3 main concepts for stakeholders to think about. First is an extension of the flexible ramping product procurement curve, and I'll note that as part of that discussion, we had the Department of Market Monitoring present their recommendation to extend the time horizon of the FRP product to account for a longer look ahead uncertainty, which they view would help better position resources and improve pricing signals ahead of potential scarcity conditions. Second, we discussed the potential to expand spin and non-spin reserve procurement beyond the minimum requirements with which the market procures it today. And finally, the idea of creating a new reserve product with an associated demand curve to enable these earlier scarcity pricing signals. So these ideas may or may not be mutually exclusive. The final design could potentially incorporate a combination of those ideas. And we'll be asking stakeholders in the comments that we release very soon to opine on that conversation. If they would like to share their perspectives on the trade-offs between those options, that would really help the ISO orient itself as we move forward into more detailed design discussions. And of course, if stakeholders feel like there are concepts that were not part of these buckets that the ISO should consider and the working group should consider, we'd love to hear that as well. Next slide, please. So in the afternoon session on January 22nd, the ISO presented a concept of anchoring market penalty prices to a value of lost load metric instead of using the market bid caps. The ISO and the working group examined the MISO's recent and active filing to FERC, with which they have updated their value of lost load based scarcity pricing mechanisms, among other things. And the ISO and the working group consider the challenges of implementing such an approach across the EDM and WEIM footprint, recognizing that one of the principles of the scarcity pricing that came out of the phase 1 working group discussions was that, to the extent possible, it would be beneficial and ideal to have scarcity pricing enhancements that apply symmetrically across the market footprint. And so as part of that, we discussed some challenges about potential challenges that may arise in implementing such an approach for the broader regional market footprint. Then also, as part of the afternoon discussion, we had a stakeholder presentation from VTOL, who presented their support for implementing an enhanced operating reserve demand curve, or ORDC as it's sometimes called, in the CAISO market that would enable prices to rise gradually as before shortage conditions occur. Next slide, please. So then, as you know, the bigger picture, just taking one more step back, we've had those 3 workshops on scarcity pricing. What we're working to on scarcity pricing is a straw proposal that we target to publish in May of 2025 that would be a joint proposal with BA level market power. And so the work that we're doing in this working group is in this proposal development and iteration blue box now, with which these discussions are useful to help inform the design that would eventually reach the straw proposal. And so keep that in mind as you participate today, that's sort of the near-term goal of what we're looking for or working towards. Additionally, not related to today's discussion, but just to reinforce that there is also working towards a May 2025 straw proposal on fast start pricing, which would be a separate proposal, but the timeline of the fast start pricing and scarcity pricing BA level market power proposals are still on the same timeline. Next slide, please. Okay, so before I go on to the next tranche of material, I'll take a moment to pause to see if there's any questions from the group or feedback.
I don't see any questions in queue, James, but hopefully folks, if they have a question, just submit in chat or raise your hand. Okay. Let's move on then. So in this bucket of information, what we like to do at these working group meetings is to have some review of the previous material that was discussed beyond just the little summary I gave on the previous slide, but to dive into some of the questions that were asked and some of the discussion that was had, just to get our brains reoriented about what had gone down at the previous session. And sometimes we have the benefit of a few extra days of thinking about and reflecting on the material, that if there is information or discussion topics from the previous session that you'd like to opine on, this would be a good time to do that. So let's move to the next slide. So first, there were, in the morning session, we discussed three potential paths forward for implementing a market mechanism to allow scarcity pricing to reach the market earlier than can be done today. And again, to repeat, those three buckets were to extend the FRP and the current FRP product in some way. Number two, to extend the procurement of spin and non-spin ancillary service procurement beyond the minimum requirements. And three, to introduce a new sort of reserve product or new method of incorporating scarcity pricing signals beyond the existing products. And as part of that discussion, there were a number of really good questions about how these things would work. For example, in the discussion on extended flexible ramping product, how that would impact the resource efficiency evaluation test in the WEIM, and what the eligibility criteria for that product would be, what types of resources would qualify, what market runs they would apply to, things like that. On the ORDC, the general ORDC discussion, there was discussion about, or questions whether that ORDC would be something that's an addition to or a modification of the existing AS scarcity pricing mechanism, which is formally called the scarcity reserve demand curve that we talked about in December. So in general, just wanting to highlight, there were a lot of good questions asked, and the answers to those questions are undetermined at this time because they're open questions that we'll need to answer as part of any sort of future design or proposal. But in any case, it was good to hear, those types of questions as that we can consider as we move forward into a straw proposal. Next slide, please. So a question was asked about how an ORDC-like mechanism would work in the WEIM today, given that WEIM entities don't clear operating reserves or ancillary services. And just a review, an ORDC or operating reserve demand curve
is a series of curves that reflect the price with which the market is willing to forego the procurement of additional reserves at a certain penalty cost. And that penalty cost, when the market decides not to procure an additional unit of reserves at that cost, becomes incorporated into the price formation both for the reserve product and for the energy. And as you'll recall, what an operating reserve demand curve looks like is that as the margin of available reserves reduces, meaning that you have less reserves available to meet any unexpected changes in demand or contingencies, then the price with which the market is willing to forego increases. And this generally leads to, as scarcity conditions worsen, then this sort of ORDC mechanism enables the market to price in higher levels of scarcity into its market prices. And so one of the options that we discussed was, well, you could potentially use the CAISO's spin and non-spin products to extend an ORDC into reserves that are not required to be procured for reliability reasons. And really the answer to this question depends on what sort of approach we take. Of course, if the path forward seems to be related to FRP product, we think this would implicate the WIM, since FRP products procured across the broader market footprint. If it relates specifically to CAISO spin and non-spin products, then of course that would not implicate the WEIM directly, because as mentioned, those products are not procured across the market footprint, at least at this time. And then if we decide to go a different route and create a whole new product, then we would need to decide whether and how that's procured across the broader market. And so the punchline here is that the ORDC can be applied to one or a combination of these options, some of which would apply directly to WEIM entities and some of them would not. And so that's part of the feedback that we're hoping to get from stakeholders in response to this series of scarcity pricing sessions, is their feedback on how critical it is for the scarcity pricing mechanisms to apply to all the EIM BAAs and not just the ISO. I'll pause for a question.
Go ahead, Stephen. Please introduce yourself.
Steve Keene from Southern California Edison. Just a question on that. I realize that the spin and non-spin markets are in the CAISO only, so they're not in WEIM. But because they're co-optimized in the CAISO markets, that does mean that they're essentially part of, or they're co-optimized with the energy in the entire WEIM markets.
Right.
If we started thinking about how, so if you put on these operating reserve demand curves in the CAISO market, that's going to have implications for the energy markets in WEIM. And essentially, the energy markets in WEIM could siphon off reserves from the CAISO.
Yeah, I agree with, yeah. Yeah, I agree with you, and I wish that given another chance that I would have made the statement a little less strong, where it says applying an ORDC specifically to CAISO spin and non-spin products would not implicate the WM, which, as you're pointing out, is not totally true, because you're right. And we've mentioned this in passing in some of the previous discussions, that the scarcity pricing signals that come out of the CAISO's co-optimization of energy and AS can trickle across the market footprint, given that if there are no transfer constraints between entities and there's trade, economic trade of supply, then those price signals should spread. The reason why I said it would not implicate the WEIM is simply because those scarcity pricing signals would only come from CAISO balancing area scarcity, and not from the scarcity of any other balancing area. So there could be times where you have. Mhm.
That's what I'm questioning though, because if there is they won't have an AS scarcity problem because they're not optimizing AS in those other areas. But if they have an energy shortage in the other parts of the WEAM, won't that pull resources from the CAISO, which basically it will have an impact on the AS situation within the CAISO? So conceivably, if there's a shortage of energy outside of CAISO in WEAM, resources would get pulled to that first, and then that shortage outside of the CAISO could create shortage in energy markets outside of the CAISO could create a shortage of AS within the CAISO market.
Yeah, generally speaking, I agree with that dynamic. So yeah, you're right. It's not. So you're right. As WAM BAs tighten and their costs increase, it will. The WAM is designed to have power flow to the entities where it's most needed, and the price signal is the best way to identify where that's true. The caveat, though, comes in the sense that the argument that we've been discussing in this working group is that it would be better to have earlier scarcity pricing signals that can achieve that sort of direction of, can indicate impending scarcity of all BAs in the WEIM earlier than can be done in today's, under today's paradigm, where it's really not until the very tightest conditions where those BAs are flirting with the power balance constraint, will the prices in those BAs be severe enough to redirect flows in their direction. And presumably, if, one of the arguments that we've been trying to make is that if you allow for these scarcity pricing signals to happen earlier, then that you don't have to get down that far into the supply stack in order to, to resolve that shortage. So the dynamics, I agree, are complicated and not perfectly one-to-one, but I hope that helps.
Yeah, it helps some. Thanks.
Any other questions on that line of discussion, or any other feedback? Okay, thanks, Steve. Okay, thanks, Brenda. And yeah, thanks, Steve, for the comment. Let's go to the next slide. So now moving more towards the afternoon discussion, in which the ISO presented on some working group discussions from phase one, and with which we wanted to explore the concept of using a value of lost load metric to anchor and scale market penalty prices off rather than the market bid cap. And there were several questions and concerns about how to best determine appropriate value of lost load levels. And we just want to reflect on that, from the ISO, price formation team's point of view, that we agree that determining value of lost load levels can be challenging and imperfect. And the value of lost load as a metric is not, a perfect metric. That said, there are established methodologies out there to make these measurements that have been used in other wholesale markets. And there are precedents that we could use if we wanted to explore this approach to inform our design. And so we talked a lot about the active MISO filing, and we'll be monitoring the FERC's ruling on that filing to see what their opinion is on the way that MISO has proposed to update their value of lost load metric, which is tied to their scarcity pricing. So we'll be doing that. But we also want another takeaway to be that it's not just the value of lost load number itself that's problematic potentially, but how we would implement a value of lost load based system across the WEIM and EDM footprint, given their, with some of the challenges that we presented. First, that the value of lost load, because there's not a single resource adequacy program in the West, value of lost load metric is not, the MISO has a large footprint and it can establish a value of lost load metric because they are all under a single resource adequacy program. But presumably for the EIM and EDM, where that's not the case, you would have different value of lost load valuations for different balancing areas. And since the market applies only a single set of penalty prices to the entire market footprint, you would basically be looking at different values of lost load for different entities and then having to pick, maybe an average among them, with which we argued would mean that some entities in the WEIM may have values of lost load that are higher than the market represents, and some that the market is representing a lower value than their willingness to pay. So that's not a insurmountable challenge, but it would make it difficult to pick a single number. Also, that the value of lost load methodology relies on the use and the precise calculation of a loss of load probability. That can be done quite easily for the CAISO balancing area, because in the CAISO VA, all its resource adequacy supply participates in the market, and the market procures all the reserves from the CAISO VA within the market. And that does not happen for WEIM or EDM entities outside the CAISO. And it would be potentially quite difficult for the CAISO to measure what is the loss of load probability for any non-CAISO VA, given that there's not the same amount of visibility in the amount of reserves, the amount of participating and non-participating supply at any given time. And so we would have to overcome those challenges. Not to say that they can't be overcome, but just that was part of the discussion we wanted to bring up in that session. So we'll go to the next slide, which is also a value of lost load related inquiry, which was, is there a relationship between the value of lost load and the EEA status? And the answer is no, that the value of lost load mechanism works continuously through market pricing and is not triggered or related to any discrete emergency declaration. However, they may be indirectly related because they're both connected to system conditions. So you would generally expect that as EEA status gets more and more severe, that you would find yourself in higher loss of load probabilities and therefore higher scarcity prices. But just to reflect here that the value of lost load itself is a single number, and how this mechanism works, the basics is that you establish this value of lost load number. For example, in the MISO filing, they would use $10,000, and the market would calculate a loss of load probability at different reserve margin levels. So as the reserve margin decreases, the loss of load probability increases, and the scarcity pricing is essentially looking at what is the loss of load probability times the value of lost load to give you some sort of expected value of avoiding, expected value of supply at that point, and causes the prices to gradually rise towards the full value of lost load as you move up into higher scarcity conditions. So that's the basic mechanics. We talked a lot more about that in the previous session if you want to go back and review, but just to reiterate that the EEA status and the vol price are not, directly related. I think there might be one more vol question before I pause. Oh, okay, we'll stay at slide 14 and I'll take a pause to see if there's any questions or reflections on the value of lost load conversation that we had. I do see a question in the chat that I can read out loud.
Okay, yeah, I'll just check in with the team really quick. There was like 3 questions. I want to check with Danny Johnson to make sure we answer that question.
Okay.
From John from SB.
Yeah, Brenda. The question kind of generally, James asks, what, if anything, would prevent the WEIM market or the ENAM market from procuring AS on a wider footprint? And the answer to that is there's no technical challenge. It's a policy choice by each participating BAA how they elect to fulfill their AS requirements. And to date, the CAISO BA is the only party who is procuring these through the market.
Thanks, Danny. I'll pause for a little longer if there's any questions or comments. Okay, seeing none, let's move to slide 15. As it relates still to the value of lost load discussion in the afternoon last week, maybe it was 2 weeks ago, one of the questions we discussed during the meeting was, what is the rationale and methodology for designing quote unquote circuit breakers? And circuit breaker in the context of scarcity pricing means that it's a mechanism in the market to temporarily suspend scarcity pricing. So specifically, how do we determine both the timing and price levels for when circuit breakers should activate? And that's a good question. And the answer generally is that there's not a single universally accepted method for constructing circuit breakers. We talked about the MISO filing has a circuit breaker methodology with which they have at various time durations of the EEA3, they will activate gradually lower scarcity prices, and I believe the first cutoff is after 4 hours of an EEA3. They would do that. So the MISO seems to be basing them on the duration of the emergency condition. Again, we'll stay tuned to see how the FERC responds to that proposal. In ERCOT, Steph from VTOL helped us understand that for ERCOT, although not a FERC jurisdictional market, but still interesting to understand different market designs, they use a metric related to the total financial or cumulative financial impact rather than any length of time to indicate when to, pare back the scarcity pricing. And so I think the direction of the working group seems to be that if the ISO were to consider value of lost load based scarcity pricing, that the implementation and design of the circuit breaker methodology is vitally important, for market participant protection, but also arguably that, there can be, if the scarcity pricing signal is no longer providing actionable information to the market, then perhaps just keeping it at that level is just not appropriate anymore. So interesting discussion there. I'll pause to see if anybody has any sort of questions or feedback on circuit breakers.
No questions in queue at this time, James.
Okay. Then let's move on to, I think, the beginning of the next set of slides, with which now we're going to redirect our attention to today's current discussion and away from the previous discussion. And so we'll have, a handful of slides to talk about, our discussion topic today. Let's go to the next slide. So again, this discussion is intended to bring up issues related to price formation, related to actions that are taken under emergency conditions that may impact prices, that are sort of independent of, general scarcity pricing as it relates to the discussion we were just having. And you know, the summarizing sort of issue that we're trying to make sure that we address, if it's there, is that while we understand that emergency actions can be necessary for maintaining reliability, and we don't dispute that, there may be times where emergency actions can mask or distort the underlying scarcity signals through the market prices, which could lead to a combination of poor outcomes, such as, you know, weakened incentives, inefficient dispatch, and reduced transparency. And so in today's discussion, we will be really focusing on the central theme of trying to distinguish between, you know, what sort of actions that are taken have, you know, poor price formation results in which, you know, which do not. So let's move to the next slide. So we want to continue to reiterate that the core purpose of scarcity pricing is to create accurate price signals that reflect real-time grid conditions and the real-time availability of resource supply. And in general, scarcity pricing is not about preventing price drops. So the question becomes, you know, emergency actions that can be taken that we'll discuss today sometimes add supply into the supply stack during, you know, discrete declarations of emergencies or other things that can put downward pressure on prices. And the question becomes, is that or is that not appropriate? And what we will need to eventually think about is that if the ISO moves towards an ORDC or operating reserve demand curve design, should these types of this type of emergency supply or emergency actions count towards the margin that's created under the ORDC? And so, you know, one question that I hope that we can discuss today is how exactly do we distinguish between emergency actions that accurately reflect an improved supply situation and those that are really artificially masking the scarcity condition on the grid at any time. So again, we acknowledge that emergency actions are oftentimes necessary for reliability, and we are just, as a working group, reflecting on the price, you know, whether or not those types of actions create inefficient price signals that the market needs to address. And we want to make it very clear that we're not, through this discussion, aiming to criticize any individual emergency action or any sort of emergency supply program or demand response program, but just to highlight that these types of actions can affect wholesale market price signals and sometimes may work against the goals of scarcity pricing. Next slide, please. So here's a few examples of some emergency actions that we'll discuss in today's session. And at the end of near the end of the presentation, I will pause. I have a slide that we can pause and reflect on other things that we missed that the working group believes that we should all consider in this tranche. But three basic examples of emergency actions. One is from the CAISO VA or from WEAM entities that activate emergency demand response programs and essentially at some sort of given level activate some additional demand response into the market. Second would be the CAISO's dispatch of certain strategic reserve resources that are typically held offline and not normally participating in the market. And finally, market operator actions, including exceptional dispatches, requesting of emergency supply assistance, and initiating firm load interruptions or initiating load shedding, and how those actions reflect market prices. I will note that in the December scarcity pricing discussion, we also talked a little bit about the impact of arming load on price formation. And it's not something that we plan to discuss today, but since we've already had that discussion, but just keep in mind that arming load may be another example of an emergency action that has price formation impacts that we'll have to think about. Next slide, please. So starting with the bucket of emergency demand response, specifically within the CAISO, we've provided some examples of some both in-market and out-of-market demand response programs that exist. And so the difference really between the in-market and out-of-market demand response programs is that the in-market programs are participating with bids and offers, and the quantity, so that they provide a price and a quantity to the market operator and receive market dispatches through the market, where the out-of-market type programs are activated and they find their way into wholesale prices strictly through the demand forecast, and they're not modeled as a supply resource in the CAISO, and they are also in a sense sort of price taking load in that they don't reflect a willingness to any sort of bid price for their activation. So in the bottom here, we make clear that in the day-ahead market, the out-of-market program values are incorporated directly into the forecast, and the forecasting team receives those from the load-serving entities that are activating these programs. But in real time, the forecast is generally following the actual load through the persistence forecast, which does implicitly count for demand response that's going on outside of the market. So in that way, again, demand response from the out-of-market type programs are incorporated or reflected in wholesale market prices through a reduction in load through the forecast. Next slide, please. So here's just a table of, just to highlight that different types of emergency demand response have different triggers, and we're not particularly interested in this conversation in evaluating these triggers, but just to give some additional information that essentially, when various emergency levels are reached, it can activate or give the option to, or enable the potential activation of various demand response programs in the ISO footprint, both in the market and out of the market. Next slide, please. So we again want to reemphasize that the purpose of this discussion is not to pick on demand response, not to pick on in or out of market demand response. I think the ISO would generally prefer to have as much of the resources available to meet demand incorporated into a market participating market model, but that's for another discussion. And in any case, to show this, I believe is the September 7th of the September 2022 heat wave. We do want to emphasize again that emergency demand response programs, both in and out of the market, have reliability benefits, and in this case played quite critical roles in supporting grid reliability during the heat wave. So, again, just to reemphasize that it's not a to make that clear that the ISO, of course, values demand response as a wholesale market participating supply or resource. Next slide, please. So those were some examples of demand response participation in the CAISO. Of course, WEIM entities can also take advantage of demand response programs as well. They show up in the market as load forecast adjustments, just like the out-of-market demand response from the ISO does. And WEIM entities are allowed to use these demand response programs to reduce the capacity needed to pass the resource sufficiency evaluation. So again, the demand response participation is not just in the ISO BA, but is an option available for all WEIM entities, and I believe is utilized by many of them. And one more point of emphasis here, again, if on this slide is that the demand response participating in the WEAM comes through into the wholesale price as a load forecast adjustment, and as of now is not a supply side resource that's dispatched by the market using bids. Next slide, please. So another sort of type of capacity that's available in the WEIM that can be accessed during emergency conditions is called available balancing capacity, or ABC. And ABC is essentially a mechanism that enables WEIM entities to set aside or designate specific resources that can be used to address power balance or transmission constraint violations in its BAA. So it's another way of thinking about it is that it's capacity that's set aside that the WEIM can use if absent that capacity, the WEIM BA would go into power balance or transmission constraint violations. It can use that, and so it's a tranche of accessible. We'll put it in this bucket of emergency supply that can be accessed by WEIM entities. And also just to note that I believe the ABC mechanism is not a CAISO BA mechanism, that it's available for the WEIM entities outside of the CAISO. Next slide, please. So I just want to point out that actually I believe yesterday, the ISO kicked off the Demand and Distributed Energy Market Integration Working Group, which is looking at various demand response and DER, distributed energy resource topics, and how they interact with wholesale markets. And just to make a pitch that there's some topics that are relevant to this discussion and potentially relevant to price formation and pricing under scarce conditions that will be undertaken in this working group. For example, we understand that there's interest in creating reliability demand response programs that are similar to the CAISO's RDRR program, but tailored for the Western EIM to get the sort of emergency demand response programs integrated as a participating market resource. Also, the working group will be discussing more higher levels of demand side bidding that can allow large loads to participate directly in the market and in the real-time market, which also has scarcity pricing implications as well. Ultimately the gold standard of scarcity pricing would enable as much demand side participation as possible, and these types of operating reserve demand curves are essentially needed because the demand side participation in real time is limited. And so the operating reserve demand curves are sort of a proxy for the value of a reliable electricity supply to consumers. But to the extent that more and more demand side entities were able to participate directly in the market using bids, they can state their current willingness to pay for supply at any given time in a much more accurate and efficient way of sort of allocating scarce electric supply than relying on an ORDC type function. So I just wanted to pitch those things. If you are interested in those types of discussions, we encourage you to participate in that working group.
And James, we also have provided that link on the chat. That recording is also available for that meeting from yesterday, so you can take a look for those stakeholders who are interested.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to pause on slide 25, please, and I will just want to take the time to inquire if there's any sort of questions, comments, or feedback as it relates to emergency demand response and price formation so far.
We do have John from SCE who asked, does CAISO have an estimate in terms of the megawatt on how much out of market DR there is in the CAISO BAA?
The best knowledge that I have off the top of my head is that when I reviewed the September 2022 summer report, there are some metrics in there that estimate the amount of out-of-market demand response that was being relied upon on the different days there. I'm not sure whether that whether the ISO routinely tracks or estimates out-of-market demand response, but I'll note that, you know, the expectation generally is that these types of programs are not active until there are, you know, tight system conditions. And I would, so if you're interested in that, where I would look is to think back to the periods from September 2022 onward, in the months where there were tight system conditions within the ISO BA, and I would, if that information is available, I would think it would be in those types of reports.
And I added a few links relevant to what Guillermo and his team presented. So those ones are kind of related on that chat. So you can kind of take a look on those links we already have publicly at the CAISO website.
Okay, so let's move to, thanks Brenda, let's move to the next slide. So I want to bring up, so moving on now, so, you know, the previous set of slides was there to highlight that, you know, at various levels of emergency conditions, the ISO and WEIM entities have access to emergency demand response that can, you know, be triggered by various conditions and are reflected either as lower demand and the demand forecast, or if they're integrated in the market like RDR or PDR resources, you know, with bids in the market and dispatched by the market. And now a different but similar type of thing happens with what's called strategic reserves. Some of the strategic reserves are in the emergency demand response bucket, but in this particular case, I'm thinking about attempting to highlight the you know, physical generators that are part of the strategic reserve portfolio. And these resources can be used when any California BA experiences an extreme event. So not just the ISO balancing area, but any of the other California BAs as well. And there's really, I don't want to get too far into the specifics about the strategic reserve, but I just thought I'd give a little information to highlight that there's basically two broad categories of these types of resources. One are long start strategic reserves with which the ISO, you know, in 4 to 7 days in advance of an emergency, forecasted emergency, the ISO notifies the SEs of these resources that they may be called upon and prepares them for operation. And the ISO exceptionally dispatches these resources in anticipation of forecasted conditions. And these resources stay online, operating at their PMIN or minimum operating level for as long as the ISO market operator deems or BA operator deems that they're needed. And they participate, some of these units participate with bids into the real-time market. So to some extent, they are integrated into the market clearing process through bids and can be dispatched by the market. There's also a subset of fast start resources with which, you know, scheduling coordinators can submit bids for all the hours in the real-time market during declared EA periods. So essentially, to take a step back, it's an additional sort of non-demand response physical supply that's available for California balancing areas that can be triggered during emergency conditions, essentially shifting this market supply curve to the right and, you know, putting downward pressure on prices as they are active in the market. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so just a quick, just a quick discussion here about market operator actions too. So we talked about different types of capacity or supply that's available during emergencies, be it emergency DR, be it available balancing capacity or strategic reserve supply. But those actions trigger, sort of additional supply to come onto the market during emergencies that are not normally economically participating in the market under, general circumstances. But there are also, potentially direct operator actions that can be taken that, trigger a response in the market that may or may not be captured within price formation. And we want to, make sure it's clear that, manual operator actions are necessary and will always be necessary. I like to think that the goal of good market design is to enable operators to have as little need to interact with the market as much as possible, but it's never going to be possible to design a market that can account for every contingency and everything that can go wrong, nor should it. And therefore, we acknowledge that operator actions are always going to be necessary. However, to the extent that the group feels like there are predictable, persistent actions, the price formation team believes that if operator actions are predictable and persistent, that it's a signal of a lack of potential necessary market functionality. And so, of course, we're not trying to argue that, yes, we think operator actions are necessary, but at the same time, if those actions become predictable and persistent, we're starting to enter into territory about maybe we need to think about ways the market can incorporate these actions directly. And also to highlight that the phase 1 working group discussed quite at length that the general principle that the market operator should be very proactive in its communication to the market about emergency actions that are being taken and provide as much transparency as possible. And so, the ISO as the market operator is always working towards making sure that standard is being met. Next slide, please. So one operator action that we want to talk about a little more in detail as it relates to price formation is in firm load interruptions or load shedding. And we want to point out the fact that during load shedding events, it's not guaranteed that prices in the market will reach the power balance constraint relaxation price, which is essentially the top of our scarcity pricing level. And the price, generally through the working group, it seems like there's been some agreement that as you move closer and closer to, an actual load shedding condition, justifies moving higher and higher on the price, on the price curve. And we want to point out that it's not always the case that the market would reach the power balance constraint penalty price during load shedding events. And the mechanics of that, how that works, are as follows. So when there is load shedding happening, it essentially means that there is, the market is seeing the amount of physical demand that remains connected to the system, but not seeing the sort of latent demand that is still, the quantity demanded generally by consumers, only the amount that physically remains connected to the system. And therefore, because the optimization is only seeing the remaining connected demand, it solves the market at an artificially lower demand level, and can be able to find a feasible solution to the amount of supply demand that remains connected to the system using the available supply, but is not accounting for the sort of latent interrupted demand. And so this can potentially lead to prices that clear below the power balance constraint penalty price, even though the system is in an emergency state requiring load shedding. Now, just because there's the possibility that this can happen doesn't necessarily mean that this will occur during load shedding events. It's just to say that, this sort of mechanism can possibly happen. And if you move to the next slide, please. We want to highlight that because one of the components of the MISO filing, and their recent scarcity pricing filing, argues that MISO is proposing to use its $10,000 value of lost load as an administrative price during MISO-directed load shedding events, or EA3s, that are occurring both in the day-ahead and real-time markets, to ensure that the high price signal is achieved during these periods, and the mechanics of what I just discussed do not happen. And so one of the things that the ISO can consider doing as it relates to reflecting actions by operators into the market price is something like this, where the ISO could consider mechanisms to ensure, be it through price floors or something else, can ensure that prices remain at the scarcity price during the load shedding events. So again, we hope we never reach those events. It's not, hopefully the implementation of better scarcity pricing prevents that sort of thing from happening. But when it does happen, we want to be prepared to send the market the right signals to come online, continue to perform, and get demand off the system. I'll pause to reflect on this for see if there's any questions, comments, or feedback on this concept. Okay, seeing none. Right, Brenda?
Yes, none.
Okay, so the discussion today is intended to reflect on the fact that there can be emergency actions inside and outside of the market, some directed by operators, some not, that can affect wholesale prices during emergency conditions. And what can and should the market, if anything, should the market be doing about this? Is it a problem or not? And so we do want to reflect, it's the ISO PFE team's opinion that implementing a robust and market-wide ORDC should help reduce the impact from actions that artificially mask scarcity, to the extent that the market prices are binding based on the operating reserve demand curve that reflects the value of the supply given the amount of reserve margin available. Should help reduce the impact of any price formation impacts that are contrary to the goals of scarcity pricing. So independent of that, and from the discussion we just had about looking into market mechanisms during load shedding in particular, the ISO does not at this time have any recommendations to the working groups on things that should be pursued as it relates to the market in this topic. And we also do want to caution here that the emergency demand response and strategic reserve programs may be time limited or may not exist in their current form forever. And so we caution against building any permanent market design features around any particular program, given that we're not not sure exactly how long those programs will remain in existence and in their current form. The other thing that I would like to take a second to reflect on is that if the ISO were to implement a market-wide operating reserve demand curve, think about all of the different types of supply and demand response that we just mentioned, and think about whether or not the operating reserve demand curve should be considering that type of supply in the margin that it's using to calculate how close we are to the edge. You know, I've heard some arguments that the emergency supply or demand response should not be reflected in the ORDC, so as not to, you know, decrease the price. There are other arguments the other way that, well, you know, the goal of scarcity pricing is to ensure that prices reflect the current state of the grid. And, you know, while I think the ISO PFE team would agree that it would be better to have all supply be participating, all supply that's available to the market to be participating economically at all times, that if there is the activation of additional supply or demand response that's available, it is a real and legitimate supply resource, and you know, arguably should be reflected in the margin that's calculated in the ORDC. So we're interested in feedback on those types of questions, and we'll be asking for comments for that in the upcoming stakeholder comments. But why don't we pause there and take some questions or comments from the group?
Sounds good. Let's go ahead and take Alva. And please introduce yourself, Alva. Thank you.
Good afternoon. This is Alva Spabot from PG&E. James, thank you as always for your presentation of these materials in such a forthright way. And actually, coming to this slide, this seems to be the first point at which your group has actually leaned in the direction of saying there's something which you're calling a robust market-wide operating reserve demand curve might be a solution here. And I have a couple of questions about what this might mean, because I don't think there was a lot of detail on that in either what you just presented or last time. So first, is the operating reserve that you're talking about procuring, is it essentially qualified for in the same way that spin and non-spin would be qualified for? In other words, would only those resources that qualify for spin and non-spin be potential suppliers of this operating reserve?
Thanks for bringing this up, because I'm intending to use this term operating reserve demand curve very loosely and generally, and didn't intend to prescribe any sort of, you know, specific design direction. What I would like you to think about how I'm trying to use this term in this slide is that it's a reflection of any of or a combination of the items that we discussed on January 22nd.
Okay.
And I'm not
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So there's still, I'd still like to then ask, or maybe this is a question to be responded to in comments, but what is the time frame that you envision this being procured in the real-time market? Is it procured in the binding hour, or is it procured for future hours?
So we of course it's an open question, so I'll start with that caveat. I think from just speaking out loud for myself, it seems to me that if you want binding price or scarcity prices to be present in the binding interval, the interval that's actually being settled, that you are going to need to connect whatever sort of ORDC or whatever sort of reserve product you're using with the binding interval, and it would have to the period with which this reserve looks ahead into the market can really be anywhere from probably as low as 30 minutes. I don't think that we would go much lower than 30 minutes, because we already have the FMM FRP and the RTD FRP product, which are, you know, lower look ahead than 30 products. And then, of course, the stuck going all the way to stuck, that horizon goes all the way to four hours. And so the decision about how much, sort of the look ahead horizon might be would probably be anywhere within that horizon. I will say that there's, in terms of just the initial concepts, 30 minutes is a good place to start, because there are other, a lot of the Eastern markets have 30-minute reserve products. And so, that seems to provide some justification that a 30-minute reserve product is valuable and workable. I'd also be thinking strongly about a 1 hour ahead product, which I think has some nice synergies with our market clearing process, since in the hour ahead time frame, you have bids that are due to the market roughly every hour. You clear hourly imports and exports on an hourly basis. You can, it's a far enough look ahead that can implicate the, maybe not stuck, but the real-time unit commitment process. So you can actually be potentially making better unit commitment decisions that incorporate, this look ahead. So those are just some preliminary thoughts to maybe help guide you in what you might want to respond in your comments, but
yeah, well,
let me know if that's helpful.
It is helpful, but so basically so the way I would think about it is anything within the hour is already encompassed in the bid set that you have access to. So it's very difficult to imagine that you're going to get anything additional within the binding hour from this product. I invite you to tell me I'm wrong and how I'm wrong, but I think the idea of procuring something for the following hour or future hours is meaningful, except that then you have to decide what it is you're actually trying to get out of resources that then provide that. And I'm assuming it's some kind of guarantee that they will be there in the market over and above what they're already providing. When I was trying to think about this, the only things I could imagine really being, giving you additional resource through this kind of mechanism would be, as you said, imports or exports, because they aren't necessarily going to be there until the binding hour, unless you potentially pay them something to guarantee that they'll be there in a future hour. And potentially also storage, because of the fact that you could essentially pay it to charge now in order to be available for discharge later. But resources like thermal or even hydro, I don't really see how this kind of product is going to get you anything in the current market structure. So that was my concern with this whole setup, actually.
Yeah, and I'll see if Danny wants to comment too, but I agree with I think that the relationship to imports is important. And I guess generally, you still have access to transfers through the WEIM as well as you get closer to the operating time. But it does seem to me that if the goal was to try to signal scarcity in a meaningful way that attracts additional supply that you would not otherwise have had access to, that you need to be doing that in a way that is attracting hourly imports and potentially discouraging hourly exports as well. And I also agree that chart storage availability is a big piece of that too. So I think I generally am aligned with your comments. And Danny, did you want to add anything there?
No, I wanted to thank Alva for highlighting the efficiencies that are potentially relating to interties and storage. Adding to that, there is a balance we're going to need to strike on what the look-ahead time frame is, because the existing WEIM overlay and base scheduling process might not be compatible with a, for example, 4-hour look-ahead product, given just the way participation occurs in the WEIM. So that's not saying participation can't change, and the participation mechanism can't be made to reflect any farther look-ahead product, but that is an additional complication that we're going to have to try to balance on whatever that look-ahead product time frame is.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think the critical thing is you want to create something that's binding beyond what is currently binding in the market. And the only thing that is currently binding in the market outside of the binding hour is the startup and minimum load, the startup instructions for thermal resources. So I think that's kind of something to build on, but it does imply you have to define something that's binding beyond the time frame of the hour, I think. So thank you.
And even there, that comment with binding is only with respect to the CAISO BA right now. So it's just another element we're going to have to work through.
Right. If you want to procure this for the system as a whole, I think you have to define something that's binding for the system as a whole beyond the horizon of the bid hour. So, great, thank you very much. I appreciate you're putting something positive here. This was sort of what I was hoping you'd come down on some concept, and I think this is a good concept to start from for trying to attack this problem. Thank you.
Thanks, Alvin.
I do have a question. Let me see if Rick, we can go ahead. Oh, just kidding. Let's go ahead and take JK, and then we'll go back to the list.
Hi, James. This is JK Wang from PG&E. Thank you very much for the comprehensive review of different out-of-market actions. I have a quick question on the current slides. Will you say implementing a robust market-wide operating reserve demand curve that should help reduce the impact from actions? Are we saying that to model the cost of those out-of-market actions into that curve, or you have something else in your mind? I just want to see if you have any specific examples that can share with us.
Yeah, operator, if we can go on to slide 30, please. So we'll break this down a little bit with you. It's a good question. And I'll start with the fact that I think that the general concern around we'll broadly call this emergency actions, is that it can introduce supply into the market that doesn't normally economically participate. And that when you're introducing supply into the market, it will shift the market supply curve and put downward pressure on the prices during scarcity conditions. And so that happens because, for example, if you are under market conditions where, let's just say the prevailing market price is $500, and then you were to, all of a sudden access 2,000 megawatts of additional demand response, that might move that price down to $300 or something like that. And that's because the price formation during scarcity conditions, absent any sort of extended scarcity pricing regime, is looking at the marginal cost of production as the way to clear the market. But by introducing something like an operating reserve demand curve, where you are proxying the value to demand for reliable supply, that it's more likely that the ORDC itself will set the binding price under scarce conditions than the marginal cost of supply. And therefore, when you have additional megawatts that are being, put onto the market during these emergency conditions, it makes it more likely that the change in price is not going to be as dramatic, because although the operating reserve demand curve may recognize that there's additional, we'll call it margin as a broad term, on the system, it may still set sort of the binding price for the market at that point, so such that the price reduction is not as dramatic. And I just want to make one more thing clear before I turn it back to you, which is that we're in no way saying that price reduction during scarcity pricing is a bad thing. And again, I'll reiterate that we mentioned in the beginning that it is our perspective that the goal of scarcity pricing is not to never have prices fall. However, what we are trying to accomplish is that the prices that are prevailing in the market are accurately reflecting the current state of the grid, which includes, or maybe not includes, the types of emergency supply or resources that can be accessed at some times. And so in the case where, you know, the activation of these emergency actions were to trigger changes in price formation that make the severity of the grid condition look like it's not as bad as it really is, then that's sort of where we view there to be a price formation problem, and where the operating reserve demand curve should help in keeping those prices aligned with the current grid conditions. So that was a long answer to your thought, but I hope that was helpful.
It is very helpful. I think at least help me to understand the statement much better. I was thinking, we had this ORDC maybe to prevent the use of some of the out of market actions by factoring its cost in the curve. But to from your answer, I understand it better. It is when those actions are actually taking places, we want to smooth the market response and make the price more reflective of the current situation, the current scarcity situation. Is that right? Okay.
Yeah,
I have two.
that's a good way of putting it.
Okay, I have two quick questions just to follow up on that. First is, you list a good amount of out of market actions here. Do we know? I'm referring to the ORDC curve of multiple markets you shared in the last working group. Do we know, are those actions usually happen to the right or to the left of that vertical line defined by the NERC requirement?
Yeah, so I guess I'll put it this way. One of the questions we're going to have to ask ourselves as we move forward with this design is whether or not we'll call it the resources that are available through out-of-market or emergency actions, should that be incorporated within what we'll call the margin that the ORDC is looking ahead. You know, for example, we've talked about at length that as you get closer to, as the margin decreases, the price from the ORDC should increase. But because we have emergency actions that can trigger the additional supply into the market, it will also look to the operating reserve demand curve as potentially, you know, additional margin, and therefore potentially a less severe grid condition. And I've heard arguments both ways that it's either proper or improper to reflect these types of emergency actions into the ORDC curve, or into the way the ORDC curve is pricing for various reasons. And this is all really happening on the right-hand side of that chart that you referenced, because you know, outside of really you're only getting into the left-hand side for pricing when you're in an EEA3 or worse. So it will implicate things like arming load and load shedding. But again, you're right that we're trying to get these signals on the more of the right-hand side, sort of earlier into the market price.
Okay, so these actions, Sorry, I was still trying to follow your answer here. I understand you try to get a signals to the right side, but are those actions taking place also to the right side, or like when they happen, they're ready to the left side?
No, these actions. So all maybe if we can go back to slide, or Brenda or operator, if you can find the table with the orange table in the demand response section. One more, this one. So all of this stuff, so this table is showing you is that at various emergency levels, you're having different sort of either in or out of market programs that are being activated. And all of this from Flex Alert down to EEA2 is all on the right-hand side of that curve. And so
Gotcha.
really the only thing, because once you get to the left of the curve, you're beyond your minimum requirements. So you're either most definitely in an EEA3, meaning you're arming load and using some of your minimum required contingency reserves to using load potential firm load shed to meet your contingency reserves, or you're in an actual load shedding condition. So yeah, all of this should be on the right-hand side.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you for educating me on this detail. And finally, I have a question. I don't know if it is possible to provide a table that contains the information of the quantity, like how many megawatts we have for each of these actions and their cost associated. I understand for some of the measures, we don't really have it outside of CAISO BA. But like to CAISO's best knowledge, is it possible to provide such information?
For some of these things, yes. For some of these things, it's a little more difficult because the ISO, for the out of market type programs, the ISO is, sort of a passive party to these types of programs. And so, I think that, estimates can be produced about how much the out of market programs are contributing. I think that was one of the earlier questions. But for RDRR and PDR resources that are modeled as supply and part of the resource adequacy, it's a little easier to sort of to count on how much megawatts are available. But for some of the other, out of market programs, it's not as clear to the ISO how much is available. And it can also sort of, it can be time varying, I think. So yeah, these are things that we have to coordinate, with other entities outside the ISO.
That makes sense. Thank you very much. That's all my questions.
Thanks, JK. Operator, let's move
Bonnie.
back to slide. Can we move back to slide 30? Sorry.
Hi, James. This is Bonnie Blair. I think I'm up next. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So Bonnie Blair, I work with the Six Cities group. I'm struggling with how to phrase this question, but if the goal of scarcity pricing is to send a price signal to elicit additional supply, how do you deal with the situation where you've hit the point where the supply is finite, no price increase is going to elicit further supply because it just isn't there, or there's some impediment to it getting into the market. And my understanding is that that's part of what happened, at least in Winter Storm Uri, that the price went up, and there just weren't any resources out there to respond. So to me, when it gets to that point, there's nothing efficient about continuing to increase prices. And how do you keep that from happening? And that's a concern I have about the whole value of lost load concept, is because it seems divorced from a recognition that at some point supply becomes finite and it just doesn't matter how much you increase the price, and then it just becomes punitive.
Thanks, Bonnie. And I agree with your thoughts, and it makes me think about our circuit breaker discussion from last week, and that's exactly why, you know, these sort of circuit breaker, and as a reminder to folks, circuit breaker in this context means that the market has some sort of mechanism to sort of turn off the scarcity pricing. I agree with your comments on Winter Storm Uri, and I will, sort of the way I've heard others talk about it is that there can be a point where the scarcity pricing no longer provides an actionable price signal. Because as you mentioned, like some of the problem with Winter Storm Uri is the prices were, it didn't matter how high the prices were going, that there were mechanical failures at various plants that couldn't respond to the prices even if they wanted to. And so I agree with you that at some point, the price signal no longer is sort of the driving force behind the amount of supply that's offered into the market. So I think that the general answer to your question is that, you know, the scarcity pricing of this nature is important to design in combination with circuit breaker methodology that sort of, you know, sort of shuts off the scarcity price once it becomes clear that the scarcity price is no longer providing an actionable price signal. And so we'll look to the MISO, the FERC ruling on the MISO filing to help us give us some sense of the precedent there. There may be others. I know ERCOT's been updating their circuit breaker design. I think PJM, after Winter Storm Elliott, was discussing circuit breaker. I'm not really sure if that ever got implemented or, you know, to FERC, but they've had conversations about it. So I'll just say that, yeah, we agree that it should be part of the discussion, and I think that's really where you would prevent some of those bad outcomes. Danny, you want to add something?
Yeah, I was going to kind of ask stakeholders in their comments to give some thoughts on how you might formulate it and what the right price value for that circuit breaker might be. There's a difference on how you would set what is the appropriate cumulative rents that a resource can take out of the market, depending upon if you have a common capacity framework or potentially if you don't, like ERCOT. So obviously in the EIM and the EDAM, we have a mix of different capacity frameworks. So no capacity framework, but also not a common capacity framework. So trying to figure out what that dollar value is will take a little bit of additional thought. And also, I apologize for the slurring words. I had some dental work done this morning, and it's still with me.
You sound very good. Don't worry. Thanks for your comments, Danny.
Next, we do have Stephen King. Let's go ahead.
Hi, this is Steve Keen from Edison. I got to admit, I'm still confused at how this is going to work across the different markets. So, you know, like it says up here, market-wide operating reserve demand curve, but operating reserves are only procured for the CAISO. So if this is meant to be the whole WEEM market, I'm not sure I understand what that means. And I'm just having a hard time trying to get a handle on how you have you have a demand curve within, I guess for demand within part of the market, but this would seem to imply that it could be met by supply from anywhere in the market.
Yeah, let's start there. So the term operating reserve demand curve, or ORDC, is an industry term, and it's not meant in this context to implicate the specific term operating reserve that you might think of for CAISO ancillary services. So if you were just to think about this as just remove the word operating and just think of it as some sort of reserve demand curve, that might be helpful in reducing some of the confusion, because the operating reserve demand curves for all of the other markets include all of the reserves that the market procures, not just specifically operating reserves. So it is kind of confusing in that way, but just think of it, it's just generally a composite curve of all the reserves that are procured.
Okay, so are you considering that to be, are you considering like FRP to be in that?
Yes.
Is it? Okay, what about, and I guess the other thing where I'm having some issues is going back and forth between real time and day ahead. So are we looking at, would that curve apply only in real time, or does it also apply in the day ahead market?
I think you would have reserve demand curves that are present in both markets, whether or not the values of those curves and the quantities are the same is up to discussion. And just to be clear, the FRP product and the imbalance reserve, as they exist today or plan to be implemented, have associated demand curves. So this term ORDC would be the reserve demand curve that's relevant for FRP, and imbalance reserve is a component of the composite reserve demand curve across the market, if that helps.
I have to think about it. I'm not sure if it helps or just makes it more confusing. Okay, yeah, I'm going to have to think about this, but I think to me that this is, I don't know if other people have these same issues, but to me that the differences between the CAISO market and the other markets, and also potentially the difference between the EDAM entities and just the WEAM entities, because I think it's, I'm trying to think about this. If this is referring to a potential product that could be chosen or dispatched or come up with, more than an hour ahead, that may be something that's optimized for the EDAM market where it's set up in day ahead. But something, I guess the way to think of that might be the imbalance reserves, which would be set up for the EDAM entities. But that same thing would not be there for WEAM entities. Right. It's a different manner. So if we're going to, and I haven't thought through what that means, that there's a difference between the EDAM entities and CAISO, where in CAISO we're doing AS, IRP, and then, and with them we're just doing IRP. But then when we get to real time, we also seems to be a three-way difference between the CAISO where we're doing AS and IRP, the EDAM entities where we've just done IRP, and then the WEAM entities where we haven't done either of those. And I'm just having a hard time wrapping my head around all this stuff fits together and what the potential implications are for the reserve prices in the CAISO versus energy prices across EDAM or across WEAM. And I can't figure out exactly how it's going to work. So I'm going to have to think about this some more, but I think this is something that I think will require at least a little bit more thought.
We agree with you there, Steve. The way we've at least initially conceptualized this is it would be similar to an IRP or a FRP. So it is a system-wide reserve product procured on a certain time interval. And depending upon what that time interval is, that informs how it settles against potentially IRP or FRP. To the extent it would interact with AS, that's then a function of is it a day-ahead product as well as a real-time product? Because CAISO procures, as a BA, procures 100% of its AS in the day-ahead market. So if it was a real-time only product, for example, it would only be interacting and impacting CAISO AS reserve prices to the extent that incremental reserves had to be procured for whatever operational reason CAISO BA has determined. So to your point, there's a whole lot to think about, and the design decisions that get made will ultimately influence what this gets settled about. But yeah, we all need to think about this, and to the extent that you can share in your comments kind of how you see this, that would be greatly appreciated.
Okay, thanks.
Next, we have Rick. Let's go ahead and unmute Rick.
Hello, good afternoon. This is Rick Benitez from BENGC. Just have a couple of quick questions in regards to the way you guys are looking to establish this, and it dovetails into what the gentleman before me spoke. Are you also going to look at synchronized reserve in this as well, or none, or just strictly operating reserve markets, both daily, day ahead, and real time? What's the angle? You know, are you going to do the dam, the bidding, you know, or the dam, which is, you know, once per day under the ahead, or the real time, which is every 5 minutes or so, or even what that would be like? And I know you guys were mentioning on 30-minute, 30-minute requirements, right? On secondary reserve as well, right? There's also the option of 10 minutes for synchronized and non-synchronized into that ORCD market. So I have questions in that, especially with the cap price you have of 10,000. I mean, as you can see, that the pricing was not a factor or a trigger point because of operating concerns, right? Due to mechanical issues and things like that that caused delay. Would there also be, because of that, if you're coming into and it's, I'm trying to, like the gentleman before me, I'm trying to grab my head around it, and looking at that, there's also the lower threshold. Where do you know, at what point can you participate with your excess capacity at the reserve market? You know, is it going to be 0.1 kilowatt? You know, what is that? You know, how long is it going to be? 30 minutes? How long are you going to be in that operating reserve on that managed, you know, reserve market? So there's so many variables that I think need to be at, both on the bidding and the deadline, the operational, the threshold, and synchronous. Some customers will not want to be synchronized with the grid. So that's also something to think about. Or are you not even thinking about synchronous, and they're just looking at operating reserve market by themselves either? Again, I went down the rabbit hole, typical engineer, so I apologize. I went worst case scenario.
Well, so listening to this question, Rick, it seems like the first question we collectively have to answer is, what time frame is this ORDC going to be looking at? Because if these can be synchronous, not synchronous, size I think is more kind of established by existing CAISO rules, but all of the questions about what portions and ramping capability would qualify for this product, they all go back to what is the problem we're trying to solve. And with this ORDC, it's from a look ahead perspective, what type of uncertainty basically are you trying to procure for it to be able to meet? And so that's the question that we need this stakeholder community's help in determining what time frame we're trying to address. IRU is addressing, or imbalance reserves, because it has up and down, is trying to address uncertainty. within an operating hour. So 15 minutes of what's the min or max 15-minute uncertainty you'd get coming out of the day ahead market into the real-time market as you transition from an hourly to a 15-minute granularity. FRP is looking at uncertainty between the 15-minute and the 5-minute market. This could be looking at uncertainty on a longer time horizon. And again, what we need help with is figuring out what the exact time horizon should be. The ISO can help with providing analytics on uncertainty and how it materializes across these longer time horizons, but ultimately which time horizon gets selected is a policy choice that we will need everybody here's input on. I hope that helps.
Also looking back at historical data of winter and summer peaks to kind of determine a little bit of that, right? Would that be provided as well from CAISO's perspective?
The CAISO strongly advocates for making data-driven policy, and so we can do the analysis, and we'll put forward the analysis that informs this, but we need to know the sphere of what is being considered to kind of be efficient on the analysis we're putting out to help inform the policy decisions. Or the funnel, definitely not the sphere.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you. So there's a couple of factors, I think, that would then sort of determine the next steps, looking at, you know, those factors that you were saying, that we talked about, the data, and also what were the risks or the issues in the past that caused that no matter what pricing, there was no operating reserve because of X, Y, and Z mechanical failures or whatever operating issues were. So keeping that in mind.
I wouldn't even classify it necessarily as mechanical failures maybe, but that one of the common themes we've heard in this process is we want the prices to rise rationally as you get up to scarcity conditions. And what has been observed when you go back and look at a lot of the previous events we've had over the last 5 years is there's quite a bit of price volatility as you get into scarce conditions. And so that's where this ORDC concept that James is putting forward can help try to essentially put a price on how stressed the system is getting and how close to scarce conditions are you to try to help the prices rise in a rational, repeatable, predictable manner.
Yeah, a variable at 1 to X or whatever it is, right? All right, thank you.
Yeah, I think we're on the same wavelength. From one engineer to another.
Yeah, looking at operational, but also market efficiency and reliability, and capping it at X, no more than this, and regardless of what, because that way you kind of keep the guidelines in scarcity and less speculative. So yeah, sorry, we went down the rabbit hole. Apologies. But it's a good exercise to kind of understand what we're trying to accomplish, and everybody, the gentleman before me and myself, don't go off into tangents of trying to solve everything.
No, thank you for your question, Greg.
Any of the hands that are still up, folks that still have active questions, or you've got your hand up, okay. Take a look at the next slide. So we want to just take a moment to reflect if there's any examples we missed or any sort of design elements that stakeholders believe are crucial to include in the discussion that we didn't get a chance to. You know, maybe it can be reflected in the comments, but let's go to the next slide. Okay, so that ends my part of the presentation today. I guess we'll take one more opportunity to pause for questions, comments, or feedback to the working group.
Well, James, I had a comment.
Go for it.
it was kind of on the concept of pricing emergency actions. And something that is worth pointing out is that the ISO is operating a market that does not have either a common capacity framework nor is under a common BAA. And so to the extent that we want to start taking emergency operator actions and using them to set administrative price floors, it needs to be considered in the context of you might have 30 different BAAs with slightly different operational practices and different ways of going about things. And we would have to normalize for that difference in any type of pricing framework that we try to put around directly reflecting those operator actions in the market. So just as everybody goes through your comments and we inspect the feasibility of this design track, just please keep that in mind.
Thanks, Danny. Okay, so I'll just pitch one more time that we will be taking formal comments on scarcity pricing preceding this workshop today. So be on the lookout for that announcement and for the link on our webpage to submit those comments. Brenda, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, James. For the next upcoming updates is that we have stakeholder they're interested to present. Please go ahead and send that over to us and add to the subject line request to present. We do have topics that are kind of wrapping up now, like James mentioned earlier. So right now we have other topics within the price formation enhancements, but if you have any other questions, feel free to send them over to us. We're gonna go ahead and wrap up on those topics as well. The next meetings we have scheduled are showing also on the policy initiative page. We plan to notice if the meetings that are following are going to be scheduled at those dates. So we plan to notice some pretty soon. So starting off with the 13th. So we'll keep everyone in the loop if that meeting will be still happening next week. But if not, we will provide that update with a notice with the daily briefing. And then also we plan to do like a written comment template pretty soon. We'll finalize that deadline as well to make sure it doesn't conflict with other stakeholder comment templates that are also during the week of November. So we'll find a good date where our stakeholders can submit comments and not have too many at the same time. So with that, and then lastly, we do have our initiative webpage here that I listed here before. Feel free to look over those links that we provided and other links that we were provided during the chat that were helpful for the questions that were being asked. And then feel free to send any questions to myself or the ISO stakeholderaffairs@CAISO.com. And lastly, we do have the Energy Blog Matters that provides updates on the industry related news. Also the new social media platform, Blue Sky, that is currently being used with the ISO to provide the same updates that were provided in X and other ways of daily briefing. But this does not replace any existing platform. So keep in mind that we will be continually using the daily briefing as a point source for different notices and meetings and anything that's more within the ISO. So just as a heads up on that. And then I don't see any other questions in queue. We appreciate everyone's engagement during this call. And if we are also going to have this call recorded and posted shortly to the website, and we appreciate everyone's participation at this time. I'll go ahead and pass it to Silas, my event producer, to help end this call. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our speakers, and thank you all in the audience for joining us today. With that, our call is concluded and you may now disconnect.